All right, we are back on the Majority Report. My name is Matt Binder, and I am joined today by my co-host, Michael Brooks. And, well, go ahead. And joining us now, he is a fellow at the Atlantic, and also, he is from Nevada. Matt Ford, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. Just had to make sure I got that Nevada right. It's Nevada. Jeez.
Oh yeah, it's Nevada. I notice out here in the East, people pronounce it a lot differently, but I'm willing to overlook it.
Thank you for that. Otherwise, I would know what I would do. So I wanted to have you on the show today because you wrote this piece for The Atlantic about the irony of Cliven Bundy's unconstitutional stand. And we had a guest on yesterday to basically update our listeners on what was going on with this whole Bundy Ranch saga, because it seemed like everyone was talking about it, but all the reports were from clearly biased right-wing news outlets. And so basically we gave our listeners a rundown, yet there still seems to be this discrepancy, even with people in the leftist communities, about what Cliven Bundy's stance is here. Because does he have a leg to stand on in terms of his claims to using the land if you're someone who, for example, like libertarians, hold states' rights above all else? And you wrote this piece that basically tackles this head on. And I personally think this is the argument that really dissolves all the right-wing libertarianism, federalist arguments to Bundy Ranch, Cliven Bundy's claims for Bundy Ranch. So let's get right to it in terms of what is Cliven Bundy arguing in terms of why he thinks Bundy Ranch is in the right in using this land for grazing his cattle.
Well, I think that you summed it up pretty well. His argument is based on a sort of states' rights doctrine that Nevada does not fall within the purview of federal law, in his view. He does not hold himself as a subject to federal law, despite contesting the BLM's actions in court since 1993. His view is that the BLM is engaged in sort of an unauthorized taking of his cattle. The BLM, of course, says that this is because he is in arrears over $1 million in fines that he owes for letting his cattle graze on federal land, which makes up about 85% of the land in Nevada. This kind of juxtaposition between endorsing a very states' rights view, saying that he is defending Nevada law, versus an overreaching, perhaps tyrannical federal government, attracted many people to his cause. And what I wanted to point out in my article was that this doesn't jive with the Nevada Constitution itself, which says that federal law is absolutely supreme.
So let's, before we get to what is in the Nevada Constitution that gives this, that basically gives pretty much ends Cliven Bundy's argument. Let's talk about, you go into the history of what led to this being written into Nevada's Constitution this way. I think it's important to bring this up because Cliven Bundy's main claim to this land is that his family's rights go back to the 1860s with this land. Could you go into Nevada's history in terms of what led to the Constitution being written in such a way?
Well, absolutely. Nevada holds kind of in the order of states that apply to the Union, Nevada holds kind of an almost unique position. Prior to the Civil War in 1860, most of the states had joined in tandem to preserve the balance between free states and slave states. So, for example, Maine joins along with some of the slave states that required a Mexican secession, so on and so forth. West Virginia was one of two states that also joined during the Union, and Nevada was the second that joined during the Civil War. West Virginia is kind of a unique example. I won't get into it, but Nevada was one of the few territories that was set up aside at the same time. Now, Nevada at this time was heavily mining-oriented. The population was very low, some say below what Congress had set for the minimum requirements to be a state. But in about 1863, 1864, the population was very eager to become a state. They thought that it would protect them from local judicial overreach. They thought it would help them more effectively tax mining companies. And so they heavily pushed for statehood. At the same time, they were fortunate because Abraham Lincoln was preparing for his reelection campaign. And Abraham Lincoln thought that it would be a much tougher uphill battle than it actually turned out to be. So he and the Republican Congress helped push through Nevada's statutes, the Nevada Organic Act. And as part of that, it required that Nevada turn over all unappropriated public land to the federal government, which they readily did. Now, the clause that I discuss was part of the very pro-union sentiment in the state at the time. They also took the initiative to add a clause to their constitution that said that they swore sort of a very deep oath of fealty to the federal government at a time when the federal government was engaged in a life or death struggle with the Confederacy. The paramount allegiance of every citizen, the Constitution says, is due to the federal government and the exercise of all its constitutional powers. Later on, it goes on to say that if any portion of the states or its people resist federal authority, the federal government may warrant the use of armed force to sort of quell the uprising.
Interesting.
Now, there are similar... I'm sorry.
Oh, I just said interesting.
Yeah.
Especially with what happened this past weekend, yes.
Yeah, there's sort of a kind of direct connection there. Now, this is the principle of federal legal supremacy isn't unusual. We see it every day, and similar kind of paramount allegiance clauses exist in some of the southern state constitutions. They added them in after Reconstruction when they rejoined the Union. Mm-hmm. Now, none of them go on at length about authorizing federal armed engagement because Nevada's is kind of unique, the passions of the time, so to speak.
So, I just want to make sure the timeline here is perfectly understood. What year is this written into Nevada's Constitution?
Well, yeah, exactly. And the timeline really matters here because of what Cliven Bundy is claiming. Now, Nevada was taken in the treaties that ended the Mexican-American War from Mexico, so that's in about the 1840s. In 1860, Nevada becomes a territory, and in 1864, Nevada becomes a state. Cliven Bundy claims, and I've seen alternative between 1870 and 1880, as to when his ancestors settled this land. Mm-hmm. So he comes in between 10 and maybe 20 years after Nevada became a state, after Nevada forfeited its public lands to the federal government, and after Nevada promised to uphold federal law at all costs.
So this is clearly all before his claim that his ancestors were there.
Oh, absolutely.
I just want to make that crystal clear for everybody listening. So this basically makes all of his claims that this is Nevada's land, the state of Nevada's land, and he should be paying the state. This all makes that moot.
Yeah. I would say that the situation would be different if there was kind of a competing claim of public land. You know, Nevada and some of the western states are much different than states out in the east, and that large swaths of them are owned by the federal government. So if he was in a place like, New York or Texas, where the percentage is much different, we would be dealing with a different circumstance here. But there's absolutely no chance that this land is owned by the state government. Even the federal court that has ordered him to turn over the cattle admits as much.
So this is an issue where this guy Cliven Bundy is basically refusing to you even say in your piece that you quote him as saying that he doesn't even recognize the United States government as even existing. He said that?
Yeah. He told a radio interview last week something to the effect of that he believes in a sovereign state of Nevada, and he believes that he doesn't recognize the federal government as, quote, even existing, which one can readily disprove by observation.
Yeah.
But it's a very kind of absolutist stance that doesn't really give him much wiggle room in terms of negotiation or de-escalation. It would be quite a thing for him to say that on one day the federal government simply does not exist, and on the second day the federal government with all its officers and marshals and judges springs forth into existence.
Now he did try to pay these fees, because I want to be fair here and make sure I get this all correct here. He did try to pay these fees to the state. He just refuses to pay them to the federal government. I believe the state sent him back the money or refused to take the money when he sent it to them.
I believe that's correct, yes. He tried to pay them to Clark County, but since Clark County doesn't own the land, they did not really have any claim to the money that he owed. That money instead rightfully belongs to the Bureau of Land Management. It's about a $200 per head fine back in 1993 per head of cattle. And, for these grazing rights that tens of thousands of ranchers across the United States pay every day, as the BLM pointed out, he simply does not believe he has to pay them because, according to him, Nevada is a sovereign state and the federal government's authority is not recognized.
So I think this really, especially with what happened this weekend and what you laid in your piece, these right-wing groups are really taking Cliven Bundy as this federalist, libertarian, pro-states' rights hero. Do you have a sense of how this is maybe activated these states' rights groups? I mean, they're clearly completely either unaware of or purposefully not acknowledging what the state of Nevada has written in its constitution, which is what they claim to want to uphold.
Absolutely. It's kind of a startling turn of events for them that they would, on one hand, say that Nevada's laws are supreme over this federal violation of their rights, so they say, and then on the other hand, the Nevada Constitution completely disagrees. The influx of out-of-state militias and state sovereigntists has been actually quite remarkable. I don't know if you've seen any of the photos in which these men are all heavily armed.
Yes.
And many of them evoke kind of comparisons, both themselves and dealing with others, to Waco or Ruby Ridge or any of the string of federal versus militia showdowns that we saw in the 1990s, many of which ended in bloodshed.
So you're a Nevadan, correct?
Yes.
Yes, I think we clarified that in the beginning. So do you have a sense of what? Because another argument I see here is that the BLM has driven off all these ranchers off this federal land, and Cliven Bundy is the last man standing, and he's the last stand between the tyrannical federal government and freedom, and their argument is that the majority of ranchers, not just ranchers, Nevadans, Westerners, are standing behind Cliven Bundy. Do you have a sense of what the majority of people, or even people who are in the area, ranchers even, what they feel about this issue? I mean, I'm assuming that people who aren't in this county, there still are ranchers, I'm sure, in the West, and I'm sure they all pay their fees, even if Cliven Bundy is the last one in Clark County or whatever county he's in. Do you have a sense of what people who are directly affected or directly affected by this whole Bundy Ranch saga, how they feel about this? One of the interesting things I think you touched upon that's worth highlighting is that there are other ranchers out there, and while Cliven Bundy may be kind of an isolated example, it's undeniable that they've all faced economic pressures over the past few years. And he cites federal regulation.
But as you know, Nevada is also in the midst of a pretty severe drought, along with California and some of the neighboring western states. There's increased competition from markets overseas, which can supposedly more cheaply raise beef. So there is kind of a sense that this is a dwindling lifestyle out west. Children aren't necessarily picking it up like their fathers did. There's a serious fear that the continuity may be broken. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all going to disappear tomorrow. There are still, thousands of ranchers in northern Nevada. There are still plenty out in, states like Wyoming, Montana, elsewhere throughout the West and Midwest. But Cliven Bundy's claims that he is some sort of symbol for this does play upon a very, serious fear that this lifestyle is disappearing. The tragedy is that the way he's portraying it is a little detached from kind of legal and situational reality. Many of the problems that he's facing are not necessarily the same problems that are affecting the lifestyles of ranchers elsewhere in the state or even elsewhere in the country.
It's really interesting to me that I'm really glad you wrote this piece, because everywhere I've been looking about just to try to educate myself about the Bundy Ranch situation, and I'm sure many people have been trying to as well, as it was pretty much the talk of the weekend, and it's still being talked about going into this week. It's just that so many people are distorting the different claims to the land. And before we end wrap this interview up, I just want to make sure that we have this crystal clear here, that the Cliven Bundy does not own this land, so it's not private property, because obviously if it was his land, he would have some sort of deed or proof of ownership to this property. He would have been paying some sort of land taxes, etc.
Yeah.
And then I'm sorry, continue. Sorry. No, please continue.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the key things, is that what the situation is that we often think that the ranches are kind of these family-owned things, and in many cases, many parts of them are, but cattle graze over a wide area. And his cattle grazed on land that was owned mostly by the federal government, as is the case in all of Nevada, as I've mentioned. Mm-hmm. That kind of changes the dynamic, because he's no longer, using his own land and then the federal government is coming to take his cattle away. That would be a very different situation. What he's doing is using his cattle on public land that belongs to all Nevadans, all Americans, really, and using that to graze his cattle, and then not paying the fees that are associated with that. Now, he may contort arguments of state sovereignty and the 10th Amendment and things like that, but it doesn't change the underlying dynamic that thousands of other ranchers pay these their cattle grazing costs. If they go over, they pay the fines. His sort of exceptionalism to this is really kind of jarring in the larger context.
It's interesting you bring that up about the ownership of the land, because it made me think, with the types of the ideologies that play into these groups that are supporting him. What would be the reaction if, say, this was private land not owned by Cliven Bundy, and Cliven Bundy was renting this land from this private landowner, and he decided to stop paying these fees? It makes me think what their reaction would be. I highly doubt armed militia groups would be showing up trying to stop this landowner from pushing Cliven Bundy off his land when Cliven Bundy isn't paying the fees.
I think you're absolutely right. When you hear some of the quotes and some of the interviews that people have done with these with the supporters of Cliven Bundy who've showed up, many of their grievances are not pertaining to necessarily federal public land use rights, which is still a contentious topic. There's definitely a policy debate to have there. Many of their arguments go to a broader sort of oppositional stance towards federal power in all spheres, whether it's immigration, whether it is simple, the other perceptions of rights that they say have been lost under the current federal government, under the Obama administration, and really the changing of a lifestyle out there that they perceive to be responsible by the federal government.
Matt Ford, fellow at The Atlantic. The piece is The Irony of Cliven Bundy's Unconstitutional Stand. Listeners, if you come across any right-wing relative, some libertarian you follow on Facebook, and they argue about the semantics of this all and who owns this land and whether Cliven Bundy actually has a claim to it, be sure to send them a link to Matt Ford's piece in The Atlantic. Matt Ford, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.